Welcome back, everybody. Now, the latest substantial drop in the price of both petrol and diesel will not see a drop in the price of basic foodstuffs. According to the latest food inflation brief from the Bureau for Food and Agricultural Policy, food prices in South Africa remain at elevated levels and consumers should expect higher prices going into 2023. The Bureau says food inflation is likely to remain high over the next 3 months as the full effects of persistently increasing commodity prices and weaker exchange rates filter through to retail markets. To help us make sense of this, we are now joined via Zoom by Marlene Louw, who is a Senior Agricultural Economist at AgriBusiness SA. Marlene, a very good morning. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome.
Good morning, Cynthia. Thanks for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. Now, we saw a significant price drop in the petrol price. So what does it mean for the ordinary man on the street?
So I think it's good news. I think purchasing power will see some relief. Consumers have been experiencing a lot of strain from higher interest rates and high fuel and food costs. So I do think it is a bit of good news at the start of the year.
Well, according to the latest food inflation brief from the Bureau for Food and Agricultural Policy, food prices in South Africa remain at elevated levels and consumers should expect higher prices going into 2023. So what's the root cause of this?
So I think if we look at official figures, the high prices are driven by high prices in cereals and high prices in meat. And that has been a consequence of global factors such as the war in the Ukraine and also dry and hot production conditions in the northern hemisphere for key grain and oilseed producers. And these high prices have filtered through to the South African context and have been amplified by a weaker exchange rate in the fourth quarter as well. So this has been pushing prices for grains and oilseeds higher. This serves as a feedstock for livestock production, which then also filtered through into cost pressures or production cost pressures for meat. So this is the short of the pressures that we've been experiencing, but it's actually a long time coming since the mid of 2021.
So will the higher inflation in terms of food only affect certain basic foodstuffs or just across the board?
There are some categories such as grains and oilseeds which have been experiencing more pressure than others. But unfortunately, it's across the board because we've also seen high increases in the cost of fertilizer, in the cost of diesel, and this is affects production of most agricultural subsectors. And as a result, inflationary pressures have been apparent in all the categories that we've seen in the food basket.
What did 2022 look like in terms of food prices?
So it increased rapidly to unprecedented levels, and that is due to the issues that I've highlighted, the war in the Ukraine, which I think at the start of 2022 we didn't anticipate, less than ideal production conditions. So all of these contributed and added to price levels that we haven't seen since 2028. And in some product categories, it even surpassed the record levels that we saw in 2008. So definitely rapid increases that added to the strain that consumers are experiencing. And this is not just a South African phenomenon. It happened across the globe.
When can consumers expect relief in food prices?
So there's a saying amongst market analysts that the cure for high prices is high prices, meaning that high prices usually induce larger production from agricultural producers and that pushes prices down. That hasn't happened yet. We do see an increase in grain production in Brazil, which is good news for global agricultural commodity prices in terms of reaching their peak and coming down. So hopefully in the second half of 2023, we can expect some relief from agricultural commodity prices. But I do think, as you've highlighted from the BFAP brief, that for the first part of 2023, we are in for persistently high prices in terms of food. Distribution and manufacturing costs for food might, however, find some relief in the sense that fuel is now a little cheaper.
And how long will the effects of rate hikes be felt by consumers?
So that's a good question. My sense, or it usually takes, there's a lag between when the interest rate is hiked and when we see the effect on final demand from consumers. And that usually takes between a year and 18 months. So hopefully our inflationary figures could show that inflation is losing momentum and that we can see some relief in terms of at least a slowdown in the hike of interest rates over the coming months.
Now, Marlene, according to figures from the British Retail Consortium, fresh food prices at British supermarkets in early December were about 15% higher than a year earlier. That's actually the biggest annual increase since at least 2005 when records started. So what does it say about the state the world finds itself in at the moment?
Yes, so I mean, across the board, we're actually facing a food crisis. I think the rate at which food prices have been increasing has made it certain foodstuffs not attainable for certain consumers. In our context, our food inflation is about 12.5%, food and non-alcoholic beverage inflation. So it's also very, very high and putting pressure on consumers across the board. So I think it's definitely a concern in terms of food security and lower income consumers having access to food. And it's something that governments are closely monitoring and managing with interest rates in order to curb some of the second round effects that could result from high inflation.
And do you foresee South Africa finding itself in the same situation as Egypt, where families are struggling to purchase household staples?
Well, this is something that I can refer to the report that you've been referring to from the Bureau for Food and Agricultural Policy. They actually monitor how basic foodstuffs or the cost of basic foodstuffs increase from one month to the next. And I do think there are pressures on the lower end of the income spectrum to afford basic foodstuffs. And then also in terms of dietary diversity, it impacts nutrition for consumers because higher priced items, typically your meat and your livestock products, are becoming unattainable for lower income groups.
Well, according to Stats SA, food prices continue to climb, reaching about, 12.5% in November from 12% in October. Bread and cereal prices were about 19.9% higher in November than a year ago. What other staples will likely increase in the next 3 months?
So the grain and oilseed or the cereal inflation that you've been referring to is actually a leading indicator for what we can see in meat prices. So because grains and oilseeds are an input into livestock production, those production cost pressures will filter through into meat production costs, and we'll see that in meat prices. The extent to which consumers can absorb these increases is left to be seen. I think, as you've rightly mentioned, consumers are under pressure. So there is concerns that those input cost pressures for producers cannot be pushed through to the final consumer because they are simply not able to absorb it. I also think products like chicken, which we import about 20% of our local consumption, could see some increases due to the weakening of the rand. So as we approach the middle of the year, ABSA's view is that the rand would gradually depreciate, and this could add to inflationary pressures in products that we import, such as wheat and chicken.
Now, we heard that food inflation in South Africa was lower than in the EU, Kenya and Zambia, but slightly higher than in Brazil, the United States and China. I mean, this is bizarre. What are some of the reasons behind this?
So I think this speaks to the nature of production in a certain country. Brazil, if you take Brazil for an example, is a net exporter of grains and oilseeds. And as a result, they would probably have lower inflation in these categories than compared to South Africa. I think an important consideration is also how the rand performed against the dollar, because most of the agricultural commodity has dollar-based reference prices. We would see when the rand depreciates that these agricultural commodities gets more expensive in rand terms. So that could also be a factor that creates that discrepancy between the different countries. So how much you import, and then obviously how your exchange rate performs.
And seeing that the raging war in Ukraine continues to rage on, so how likely will we be affected, by the ongoing war in Ukraine in terms of food prices?
So this is an open question. I think what's key to monitor there is to what extent their agricultural exports, so in terms of Russia, how their wheat exports, and in terms of Ukraine, how their corn and sunflower oil exports are affected by the war. So we've seen in 2022 that the exports had like a stop-start during the course of the year, where plans were made for alternative export routes. There were some treaties that allowed Russia to export wheat through the Black Sea. So this is an evolving issue, and I think it's something that market analysts and participants are keenly monitoring. The fact that the war is continuing, I think the safest thing to say is it would add uncertainty to agricultural and food markets, and we're likely to see some volatility and uncertainty continuing into 2023.
And Marlene, do you think the food industry and perhaps the retail sector is transparent in the local food value chain?
Well, I think, thank you for the question. I think, yes, it is transparent in the sense that we have multiple role players that competes in the market. And also, I mean, the grocery chain and food value chains are keenly aware of consumer circumstances, and they need to function and play in that environment. So, yes, I do think that we have a very sophisticated and well-developed food value chain.
But where in the chain does inflation remain stubbornly high?
Well, I think the most obvious one over the latter part of 2022 has been the manufacturing and distribution cost. If you just take the fuel component and by how much that has increased over the second half of 2022, that has played a significant role. And although we've seen some decreases now at the start of January, it's not to the extent that fuel prices have been in 2021 or even pre-pandemic levels. So those issues are remaining stubbornly high, and I think the fuel component also starts playing into manufacturing and storage costs, because that now needs to be supplemented with fuel generation through generators and the likes because of load shedding. So I think there's a lot of factors at play that is keeping prices high.
And you seem to, to be in support of this. Well, you seem to subscribe to this school of thought that the food industry in South Africa is very transparent. And should there be a drop in the food prices, do you think that the industry is passing on the lower costs to the consumers or not?
So that's a complex issue, and I think what we should be aware of is that it's not a linear process. So it's not that when maize prices go down by 20%, you would see a 20% reduction in maize meal. So a product comprises of obviously the agricultural commodity component, but then there's also manufacturing, there's your administrative costs, there's distribution. And I think that should be kept in mind when you consider the different nodes or the different price points in a value chain. So let's say maize prices or fuel prices decreases significantly, but you do not see a corresponding change in retail prices. It could be a result of other issues that are adding cost pressures within the chain. And we've seen a lot of these recently from issues like increased Eskom tariffs, increased municipal costs, increased wages, if you consider certain industries. So I think it's a very complex issue, and it's not something that you can just analyze by looking at two different price points.
Yeah. Maybe put simply, if the retailers in the supply chain for food are withdrawing the savings from the consumers or on the other end of the chain, so who is the biggest loser? Who is the biggest winner? And should the retailers be taken to task for withholding such savings?
So I don't think that's really my domain in terms of answering the question. My sense is that the food value chain in South Africa is well developed. It's very efficient. It ensures that food gets to the various consumers around the country. I think in terms of really analyzing the transparency and taking someone to task, if there is someone to be taken to task, that falls in the domain of of competition authorities. My sense is that we do have sufficient competition in our food value chains, and that there's no incentive for anyone in the value chain to exploit the final consumer, because ultimately you want to be able to function sustainably in a market over time.
Marlene, there's a principle aptly called shrinkflation, which essentially means the drop in value of a particular product, yet the price remains the same or is even higher. So how should South Africans or how should consumers deal with such inflation? So say, for instance, a loaf of bread weighed 800 grams, but it's now 700 grams, yet the price remains the same or even goes higher. So how should consumers deal with it? And is that a prudent principle?
Yeah, I don't think there's a clear guideline in terms of dealing with something like that. Obviously, the value that the final consumer gets out of a product that has been adjusted in terms of size, although the prices remain the same, the value to the consumer is less. But again, this is a complex factor that food manufacturers turn to in order to preserve their margins. So again, we need our food value chain and consumers to function sustainably over time. And so if your margins are under pressure, but you cannot charge a higher price, oftentimes the only solution to food manufacturers is to adjust the size of their product and keep the price the same. So I think this is a concept of preserving your margins in order to be able to function sustainably over time. So obviously, any business are in the game in order to remain sustainable over time. If you can't do that, if you don't cover your costs or make get a return on your investment, you would not be in that business.
All right, Marlene, lovely chatting to you. Thank you so much for having this conversation with us this morning.
Right, thanks, Abiwe.
Thank you. Marlene Louw, who is a Senior Agricultural Economist and AgriBusiness SA, helping us make sense of food prices heading into the new year.